Good morning. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for organizing this session today. I think it's been really interesting and very informative. So hopefully with this session as well, you can have something new to learn about and something to apply to the project. So I'm going to talk today about funding mechanisms for major rail projects. And to do so, I'm going to draw on international rail experiences that we have seen in other countries to try to see how we can apply those to the case of the Budapest Danube Tunnel. So I'm going to give a quick word about STEER just to introduce ourselves in case you don't know us. And then I'm going to talk about the need for funding and why this is particularly important for major rail projects. Then I will continue to talk about what the funding mechanisms are for such projects. And then I will conclude with a few international case studies which can illustrate what in theory can be done, but also in practice has been delivered. So quickly about STEER. So as David said in the morning, we are an international consultancy focused on transport, and we worked across a range of topics, so from commercial, economic, financial, technical, and strategic areas, with a particular expertise on the rail sector. So we've worked on a number of large infrastructure projects on rail. So in the UK, a few examples are Crossrail, which many of you might know, but then HS1 and HS2, the two high-speed lines in the UK, and also a number of other projects across Europe. So my role in the work we're doing for BFK at the moment, I'm STEER's project manager, and we were advising both on the funding side, which I'm talking about today, but also providing expertise on the aspects around wider economic impact. So we're providing experience across those two things, and hopefully this will be something that we can apply for the project and also for future projects, as Diego was alluding to earlier. So if we start talking about funding mechanisms, so the first thing to think about is why they need to talk about this thing. Why is it important for this kind of project? So in particular, for major infrastructure projects, as it's quite obvious, they will require substantial amounts of funding. So because the cost is very high, there will be, as it's the case for many projects, public funding available for it. But in this case, because the amount is so high, it will be probably not sufficient, or maybe not sufficient. And also there will be a lot of competition across the different governmental agencies. So there will be a lot of big rail projects, big transport projects, but also education, health, and other topics that the government wants to invest in to develop the policies. So therefore, it's interesting to think about other potential alternative sources of funding that can help contribute to the project and that can help deliver it ultimately. Just a clarification in terms of terminology. So we're talking here about funding, but then sometimes we talk about financing. So what's the difference between the two things? So when we talked about funding, and I will use an example to clarify it. So I will use the example of buying a house, which is something that we all know about. So when we talk about funding, it's about the sources that will pay ultimately for the investment. So in the case of buying a house, it will be the salary that you have over the years, and that can help pay for the house year on year. In the case of financing, it refers to the need to have all the money at the beginning of the project, because you have to build a very expensive tunnel and all the infrastructure. So in the case of a house, you would go for a loan to a bank, and they will give you some money, which you will repay with your funding over time. So in this presentation, we'll talk about funding, but we have to remember that there's always the two aspects about funding and financing. So we've talked about why it's important to have alternative, or to identify alternative funding mechanisms. Now, how do we, in practice, identify what are the appropriate alternative funding mechanisms? So this follows what we've called the beneficiary pays principle for funding. So the rationale for that is that whoever benefits from the scheme somehow, to a greater or lesser extent, should be able to contribute financially to it. So we've drawn here a small diagram which tries to define the different pieces of the puzzle of the components of the funding mechanism. So we have the transport infrastructure itself, which is constructed. We have the beneficiaries, and then we have the funding itself. So the transport infrastructure will provide a number of benefits. So as we will hear in the next presentation, that could be journey time benefits, it can be environmental benefits, it can have to do with the land itself, it can be a number of things. And then there's a number of beneficiaries, and I've listed here a few, and this could be quite varied and quite ranging. So it could be businesses, it could be employees, it could also be the users, it could be developers, and it could be landowners. So it could be a range of them, and they will have different interests and objectives, but also the benefits that they will see will be different. So the idea is that these beneficiaries will receive benefit from the infrastructure. They will keep some of the benefits to themselves, but will also capture some of the value that they get and will translate it into funding for the project. So essentially, because they're getting benefit, it's in their best interest to contribute to the project financially, and with that money that they give to the funding, they enable for the project to be delivered. So it's a cycle that completes itself, and hopefully with the different types of interventions and actors and stakeholders, and together with other types of funding, then the project can be delivered and everyone benefits from it. So that's sort of the theory around why we're talking about that and how to identify them in practice. So some of the funding sources which are typical for these kind of major rail projects, as I was talking about at the beginning. So the first part of the funding mechanisms is something that everyone will be quite familiar with, but I think nonetheless it's quite important, so I wanted to talk about it. So it's about European-wide funding and also national funding. So the first one is grant funding from the European Union, which is something that David this morning and also the Secretary of State have talked about as something which is really fundamental to deliver the project. So this is typically grant funding which comes from European Commission or European Investment Bank or the ERDF, which is given as normally as a grant. So it's money that is given to develop the countries and to develop the infrastructure, and is probably going to constitute a great proportion of the funding for the project. There's another layer of it which is more specific, which I've noted as European Union green funding. So this is to do with a new funding stream that has come a few years ago, a couple of years ago, to do with the need to combat climate awareness and combat the environmental challenges that we're all facing. And it's funding which is allocated to projects which have a component that combats the European funding. So this is obviously quite important for transport projects, but in particular to rail projects. So it can be another source that comes from Europe that can help contribute and fund the rail project. And finally, as is typical for most projects in transport that require large investment, that can come as well from central government that might want to fund the infrastructure themselves because they see a benefit to doing so. So if we go to the next one, probably a bit more interesting and that we've seen in other countries. So I've named that as land value capture. And this is something that is not that widespread, but we've seen in a number of countries already, and it's quite interesting. So we'll see a couple of examples later on the international case studies. And I think the principle about land value capture is that typically, especially in the case of rail infrastructure, you will develop stations, and these stations will have some land around it, which is really not developed. So we've seen throughout the day today that near Nyugati and Delhi, there's a lot of land which will be freed and which will be able to be used for other purposes. And the idea is because we have a new station with more connectivity and with a lot of benefits for the passengers and for the people who live around it, the value of the land around the stations will increase over time. And what we want to do with the funding mechanisms is to be able to capture some of the value increase in the land, use that to fund the project and to construct it. So I think from the theoretical point of view, it makes sense, and also from the point of view of the landowners, it will make sense as well because they will benefit from the infrastructure, as I've said a couple of times already. And I've identified two ways of capturing this value. The first one is on the land which is publicly owned. So it could be by the state or from other sort of public organizations. And the idea is to sort of develop the land to a state that can reach something close to planning permission, so something which gives the private developers confidence that it's land which can be developed. And then at that point, sell the land, taking into account the value that it will have in the future. So because we can estimate that it will increase in value, I can capture in my sale of the land to developers the value of that future land, and therefore I can capture some of that profit to fund the scheme. So as I said, this captures the future value and not the current value of the land. The second one is for land which is currently owned by the a number of private organizations. So obviously the mechanism is different, but the principle is the same in that you can capture some of the value, but the mechanism in this case is to say, okay, in the conditions that you will have to develop the land, I can levy you a tax, so I can put a tax, an additional tax onto the development, which you need to pay if you want to develop your land that we're going to use to contribute to the development of the infrastructure. So as I was saying, this only works because it works in the interest of both ourselves, because we want to have a new infrastructure, but also the developers, because they will see a benefit in the land that currently has no too little value to a land which will be very valuable. People will want to go to work and to live there. So that's another way to capture land value increases, but when the land is owned by the private sector. And then a number of other mechanisms which are also typically used, but maybe less commonly or depends on the context. The first one is around tax funding, and I've talked a bit about the tax funding for the privately owned land, but I think the principle is the same that we've talked about. If we have something which increases in value, so it could be the land that we've talked about, but it could also be the number of tourists that come to Budapest because it's more attractive. It could be, all the people that now want to use the infrastructure because it's more attractive. We can have higher taxes collected from them from different sources. So I've noted, for instance, here a couple of transfer tax. So imagine that there's a house which is already built around the station, and because it becomes more attractive, people might want to sell it to another organization or person, and because the value is greater, then the tax collected by the authority is greater. So I think the principle is, can we somehow ring-fence that tax which is collected and give it to the project? Because in principle, yes, you can have tax which goes to government and is organized. But if we can manage to ring-fence the tax which is as a result of the project and use it for the project, then it's another funding stream that you can use to construct it. Second one is around modal shift, and I will probably talk about the first one, which is the parking levy. Essentially, you want to build a rail infrastructure which essentially and ultimately, and as we were hearing this morning, takes people from car to rail. So because I want to do that, I can impose some conditions to some of the car users at the moment. So something which was done in Nottingham was to say, okay, if people want to park at the offices of some of the buildings and employers, they will have to pay a levy, so businesses will have to pay a levy for that. So that has two effects. The first one is that employers will contribute to the funding, because if people will keep using the car, that will be a funding source for the project. The second one is that some employers won't want to do the payment, so therefore more people will transfer from car to rail. So that way you achieve two objectives. The first one is to attract funding, and the second one is for more people to use rail instead of car. And then the third one, which is around direct contributions from stakeholders. So it could be all the stakeholders around the area that might have an interest in the project. So we can think of a commercial estate near the station that can think that having more people traveling to the estate or to the mall might have a value. So they might want just to directly contribute. And this is something we've seen in the UK, for instance, for Canary Wharf. And finally, the last one is around the farebox surplus. And we will see an example of that for Crossrail. But the principle is that if I have a railway which attracts more people and more people travel and pay fares, then I can use that money to fund the project on an ongoing basis. So I've talked now about some of the mechanisms a bit theoretically. So I'm going to talk now about a few case studies which we've looked at and I think can be inspiring for the case of the Danube Tunnel. So the first one is the case study of Crossrail, which is, I've put here a map of the layout, but essentially it's an east-west rail connection in central London. So it has quite a lot of similarities to what we're looking at here for Budapest. And essentially the purpose of this was to connect the sort of areas in the east of London to the areas in the west of London, minimizing the connections and the interchanges that you have to do in between. So the investment which was required for this railway is very large. So it was around 17 billion euros when it was planned. And a funding package to sort of come up with sufficient mechanisms to fund it needed to be put together. So I've put together a graph here which shows how the infrastructure was funded at the time. So there's three main sources of funding. On the black bar at the top left, we have central government funding. So this is typically what I've described at the beginning. The government is interested in the project and brings in money to construct it. So that was around a third of the project funding. Secondly, we have a proportion which is the surplus of the fare box. So in London, the fares are relatively high. So typically, when you open a new project, you will have an amount of the fare box revenue which can be used to offset the operating cost, but another part can also be used to fund the project. So a good proportion of that was also used as the second source of funding. And then on the orange part to the right is all the other mechanisms which I've talked about earlier, but which were used to the case of Crossrail to fund it. So the most important one of these, which made up 28% of the funding for Crossrail, was what's called the business rate supplement. And this is very simply to do with the fact that business will benefit from having Crossrail. So as I've talked before, businesses have an interest of more people coming to their offices quicker and more conveniently. So therefore, they're willing to pay. And therefore, it makes sense to put a supplement onto the tax they normally pay for having a business that can be ring-fenced, as I was saying, to fund the Crossrail infrastructure. The next couple of funding mechanisms, which make up for 4 and 3%, have to do with the land value capture that I was talking earlier. So, and these distinguish between the land which is owned by private organizations and the land which is owned by public organizations. So on the logic that I presented before, for those pieces of land which were owned by the private sector, then a development levy was taxed. And then for the land which was owned by TfL, a process similar to what I described about developing to the state that it can get planning permission and then selling was another source for the funding of the infrastructure. And finally, we had some other contributions from stakeholders, which, as I explained in the case of the commercial estate, are willing and were willing in the case of Crossrail to contribute to the funding of it. So I think this case study is quite interesting because we can see that these alternative funding mechanisms almost made up for around 39% of the funding, which is quite substantial. So I think it's one of the interesting case studies to look at and to think about in the case of the Danube Tunnel as well. The second case study as well is in London. So this is what's called the Northern Line extension, which actually was opened a couple of weeks ago, so it's now operational. And this required, again, quite substantial amounts of funding, in this case 1.4 billion euros when it was planned. And it had a great proportion, a very large proportion of the funding coming from third-party sources. So as I've put on the table, it's around 81% of the funding coming from alternative sources. And the two main ones that were used at this point were the first one, the enterprise zone, which is really just an evolution of the business rate supplement that I was talking about. So essentially taxing businesses because they get a benefit from the scheme. The only difference with this arrangement is that there was a legal framework which was created to ensure that all the benefits that were used and gained from the scheme for a period of 25 years could be directly allocated to the scheme. So it was a legal framework that already facilitated all that I said about the ring fencing and just making sure that the money was used for the project, which is normally a challenge because it's, tax, if tax is collected, it can go to other projects. So the ring fencing is important. And then the second part, which I mentioned there, so I've described the community infrastructure levy and the section 106, which is really just other words to talk about the land value capture mechanisms. So again, as we can see in the map, I haven't put a picture here, but we have a very important power station in Battersea, which has been redeveloped by Norman Foster Architects. So all the value that has been generated around the station of Battersea can be captured by the project and used to fund it. And finally, my third case study is in the USA, so in New York City, and it's the Hudson Yards program of redevelopment. So as part of a big redevelopment of a number of a district in the west part of Manhattan, there was an extension of the subway line 7 to it. And this had a cost of around 2.4 billion euros. So again, in the scale of very large projects, as we're talking about here today. And at the beginning, this project was going to be fully funded by alternative sources. So no public funding was going to be introduced. So you will notice that I've added here a line for public funds. And the reason that's in the bar is because the private contributors had agreed to the initial cost for the scheme, and then there were some cost overruns, so the government came in and stepped in and put some of the money. But from the outset, it was going to be a scheme that was going to be funded purely and fully from private sources. And again, it's drawing on mainly the two aspects that we've seen on the previous projects. So it's around the taxes to businesses and to other parts and stakeholders that benefit from the scheme. And then using some of the concepts around property tax. So when I talked about the tax funding capture mechanisms, so because the land of the property increased, that was some money that could be used for the project. So just to conclude, how and why this is important to the Budapest Rail Investment Program. So I think it's really three things. The first thing is quite obvious, and I've been talking throughout my presentation about large infrastructure projects, and the Budapest Tunnel is on the same scale of this kind of infrastructure. So it's obviously important to think about other sources that can complement both the central government funding, but also the European funding. So it's something that can provide additional robustness to the funding package that can be put together for the scheme. So that's the first and obvious reason. The second one, and that has a link to the next presentation that we will hear now, is about the wider benefits that the scheme will have. So the scheme will not only unlock some of the value that can be captured financially, it will have what's called wider economic impacts. And this is something which is typical, especially in the UK, but also in other countries, which are around the benefits which are beyond the pure transport benefits. So it's not just about I can make my journey 50 minutes quicker. It's about the economic growth of the city, the connectivity between regions, and the bringing together of places and jobs and people closer together. So because we can see that this scheme has such a size that can generate substantial amounts of wider economic impacts, it makes sense as well that some of those benefits can be captured through funding. So there's a close link between the two things, and that's why it's important to talk about funding for this project in relation to wider economic impacts. And the final one is around the context that we've been hearing the whole day today about all the land which is available around Nyugati and about Delhi Station and about a number of sites which can be made available once the tunnel is constructed. So this has a clear indication that the scheme can benefit from land value increases in these pieces of land. So it's a very important opportunity for the developers of the scheme to capture some of the value as part of the funding for the scheme. So, yeah, so essentially, the scheme is already pointing to looking at these kind of things and exploring further how this can be used in the benefit of the scheme. So that's my last presentation, my last slide. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.